Have you ever felt like a triangle in a world of circles and squares? Many missionaries have often called this the third culture kid experience. Today, I talk with Daniel Yang about his experience and what he refers to as an estranged pioneer. He's also going to share with us some research about some of the reasons African Americans join white evangelical spaces. I'm excited to welcome Daniel Yang on another episode of Why I Stay. Welcome to a podcast about disciple making in the public square, where we talk about everyday issues from a biblical and balanced perspective. This is where life exists. This is Where Life Exists, where we talk about everyday issues from a biblical and balanced perspective. My name is Dahadi Lewis, lead pastor of Blueprint Church and the vice president of the Sin Network. I am here with Daniel Yang, the director of Sin Institute. What's up, Daniel? How are you doing, sir?
Hey, Dr. Dahadi Lewis, good to be with you, brother.
Man, it's like you love saying that doctor part, but
I honor you. I honor you.
I try to keep a low profile.
And since it was your birthday, I also want to honor you as an elder too. So,
man, I am feeling the elder. You starting to see the gray hair. I cut it off so that we can see less and less. So. But it is what it is. There's only one way to get around getting older. So I'm not really for that way. So
embrace it.
I'm embracing it. I am embracing it. So, man, Daniel, both as someone who has done research in this area, but actually someone who is a minority in white evangelical space, I want to jump in and first kind of start off with just telling your story of how did you get involved or get connected into white evangelical spaces?
Yeah. Well, honestly, the from the very beginning, like I'm Hmong ethnically, and my parents were introduced to Jesus through a white denomination, and I grew up in the Christian Missionary Alliance. I came to Jesus at a Southern Baptist church going through Awanas, and so in some ways, God used white evangelicals to reach my family, to reach our people group. If you study the history of the Hmong people, they were reached through both the Christian Missionary Alliance and Southern Baptist missionaries. So I feel like it's a part of my spiritual heritage, and it's been so foundational to not just receive the gospel from evangelicals, but now to partner alongside. It just makes a lot of sense. That's a big part of my history. And then when I started planning churches, I was mentored by a Southern Baptist pastor named Bob Roberts Jr. out in Fort Worth, Texas. And he was my introduction back into serving alongside the evangelical world, but specifically through the Southern Baptist and the North American Mission Board. And so I feel like it's been a part of my spiritual heritage and lineage.
Yeah. So was there ever a time, with it being a part of your spiritual heritage and lineage, like was there ever a time that you actively said, I am joining or engaging in white evangelical spaces, or has it just something been kind of the next logical step?
Yeah, so to answer your question, yes, because although my family and the Hmong were reached by, kind of predominantly white evangelical missionaries and denominations, the church that I grew up in was very much an ethnic immigrant church. And so where predominantly we spoke Hmong in our worship services. And so I did make a very conscious decision. As a matter of fact, I don't see it as me leaving the immigrant ethnic church. I felt like in some ways I was sent out. I was commissioned. It was a natural part of a mature immigrant church being able to send out one of their own. And so when I was sent out as a church planter from my local church, and that was kind of a series of going to seminary and then coming on staff at a church in Texas, I felt like it was an extension of a mature immigrant church learning how to send out their next generation. But I will say that, it was a conscious decision to leave an immigrant congregation to come on staff at a predominantly white church, which is the church that I was mentored under Bob Roberts in Fort Worth. and then to plant a multi-ethnic church. And part of that was learning how to lead in a non-immigrant ethnic environment, and that was like a necessary learning process. So that was a very intentional decision.
Yeah, and so you went, you left, and you planted some multi-ethnic church, and then you came to be a part, of the Sin Institute. So it's like you re-entered into kind of again a predominantly white space. Talk to us a little bit
Yeah.
about that decision and kind of what you hope to get out of that, that
Yeah.
decision.
Yeah, at the work that we do at the Sun Institute, it's a partnership between the North American Mission Board and the Wheaton College Billy Graham Center. We work with those who lead church planting organizations, and at the denominational leadership level, it is primarily middle-aged, older white men. Because that's what our institutions are. They were started by, they are led by. We're at a point in the demographics in the United States where that cohort of boomers and Xers, uh, they started the networks, they started the organizations. They're still leading it. So for me, Dahadi, I think it's learning that many of these leaders have a desire to hand off the leadership of the organizations to a more diverse next generation. And a lot of them are making those transitions. And I think in some ways, I appreciate being able to sit in those rooms. There are moments when I ask myself, why am I the only non-white person in a denominational like setting? But the reality is that a lot of people inherited their organization. They inherited their position. And not all of them are intentional about transitioning their work to a more diverse leadership team, but a lot of them are, and they're really making some tangible steps. We're doing that at NAM in some ways. I see a lot of other networks and a lot of organizations really intentional about recruiting gifted, talented people that can lead across the organization, and then not just represent diversity, because I think you got to be careful to avoid tokenism, but to really lead the vision into a new direction. And we're starting to see that.
Man,
That's part of the reason why I do feel invested in it.
yeah, that's great. And in that, like you said, you get a chance and a lot of exposure to a lot of different, and it causes you to be able to kind of lean into different research projects and different studies and different things. I want to get back to you, but you mentioned in there, like part of this is specifically where you did a study around some African American pastors, planters, of why they joined white evangelical denominations. Share a little bit about that experience and what you've heard around, specifically in your research.
Yeah. Yeah. And what it was a case study of three African American church planters that planted with predominantly historically white evangelical denominations. And there were a couple of findings, and I'll just kind of rattle them off. The first finding was that these three African American church planters, they appreciated the orthodoxy of those particular evangelical denominations. And so there was a commitment to a conservatism, a commitment to scripture that they really aligned with. I think at least two of those that I interviewed, they would have said that they came from traditions that were a little bit less orthodox, or at least they were headed in that direction. That isn't to say that there's full agreement with the spectrum of theology that they came into, but that's to say that they felt like there is a reasonable amount of focus on the right primary issues, and that's what made them comfortable. Secondly, was there was a great appreciation for missions and church planting. They felt like the organizations, although largely white still, they felt like there was a genuine desire to partner and to really reach all kinds of people, but specifically African Americans and those who came from, maybe more urban inner city environments. And so there was an appreciation for the investment in missional focuses. And then the third one was there was always some level of active advocacy and solidarity of a certain white leader. So it would have been either a seminary president that advocated on behalf of African American leadership. It would have been the head of some institution. There was always like some proxy or some advocate. To use a phrase from a great book that was written by the Dr. Dhati Lewis, there was always some advocate that was actually working on behalf of African American issues within the organization, and that was probably a key thing, because they were able to look into the organization and see that there's actual people that are working to create spaces and structures so that minority leaders can thrive and lead. And I would have to say that none of these by themselves were, sticking points, but it was this like triangulation of these three things that came together that made it somewhat comfortable for African American leaders to step into those spaces and at least to try it out. I'd say that it's left to be said if the staying power of those three things will sustain it over decades, but at least those are the initial three reasons that I found that some African Americans were joining predominantly white evangelical denominations.
And I love how you even make that delineation, because we even talked about it. You said 2 out of the 3 are still there in it, and then 1 has left in your study. Yeah. And I think that that's important for us to say, and because, like you said, it's a difference between why they're in, but why they stay, and the staying power can be very and fairly different from what's going to keep. But I also want to touch on the idea, we talk about advocacy, because in all of what we're saying is this idea of let's stay, but let's be prophetic in our stay. Don't just be able to speak to what you feel like needs to be spoken to in a way that dignifies people. And I think that that's a critical thing, is the idea what you talk about, advocacy. Like we need to be able to be advocates within these spaces. So let me ask you this, Daniel. What has been some of the difficult or most challenging things that you've encountered in staying?
Yeah, there's always going to be a level in which, as a person of color and Asian person, there's always going to be a level in which you're always wondering if you're just being tokenized. And I don't know if that ever goes away. I always think the best in people. So I never assume that I'm there just because I'm the minority or the Asian person. But over time, you begin to realize when people come to you and they have side conversations, you begin to realize that, oh, now I know I'm here because I'm here to create a more diverse room, which I appreciate. But that's attention. It's not more good or more bad. It's this attention that I think most of us who have been in those rooms, you understand, and you just learn how to embrace. Part of it is you have to believe that you're there to bring change. Some of the other things that I have found to be very difficult is when we're a part of large evangelical institutions, there's a spectrum of people. There are those that are very dogmatic and very fundamentalist, and then there are those that are very progressive and very radical as well. And especially in the day and age that we're in the year 2020, that polarity is very strong. And sometimes I feel like myself caught up in it, because whether it's the issue of race, whether it's an issue of a particular theological position, I feel like some of those conversations are very specific to white people. They don't have a whole lot to do with me, but that frames the backdrop for everything that we're talking about. To say it a different way, it seems like every conversation is centered around whiteness, and sometimes you kind of feel like you have to just deal with that. And for me, that doesn't mean that I struggle with staying. What it just means to me is that I have to realize that I have to derive my primary identity not from these spaces. I have to find that level of comfortability within security within inside myself, that although I'm serving in these spaces and I want to be helpful in these spaces, I'm not going to derive my primary identity from these spaces.
Yeah. Do you feel like you have to go outside of these spaces in order to get the staying power, to keep the staying power for you specifically?
It has less to do with majority culture, Dhati. I think it has more to do with my personal journey. I was telling you earlier, I grew up in an ethnic immigrant church, and then I came on staff at the predominantly white church. I planted multi-ethnic churches. Now I'm back to actually helping to be a part of a second gen Asian church plant in the Chicagoland area. For me, it's not so much about like having a place to withdraw to. That's not so much of it. I feel like God is taking me through many phases of living out my ethnic identity in Christ, and I'm just kind of testing them all out. But I will say that I've learned over the last 3 years to develop additional support around me, so that when I feel frustrated in the majority white spaces, I can process some of that safely with people. I think that's really important. And these people understand my calling, and they want to see me succeed in my calling. So they're never going to tear down the spaces that I'm a part of, but they're going to help give me perspective. And I think that's really important. That's a new season that I'm walking in.
Man, that's great. And having those diverse experiences gives you the ability to kind of, like really processing, like you said, to discover kind of how God has made you and wired you, in your family.
And I'll share this. I mean, there's some research that comes from Corey Little Edwards. She's out of Ohio State University, and she interviewed 150 African-American pastors and Asian-American pastors that pastored multi-ethnic churches. So it's a very kind of interesting dynamic. African-American or Asian-American pastoring multi-ethnic churches. And she found consistently that both African-Americans, Asian-Americans, if they leave their culture of heritage, churches of heritage, to pastor multi-ethnic churches, they found this like limitable space where like it was like you weren't fully Asian, African-American in terms of like your ministry, but then you were also always catering to white people in your multi-ethnic ministry. And that tension, I didn't know, I experienced that tension too, and I couldn't name it until I read her work, and she calls that the estranged pioneer. And I, just knowing that other people are experiencing that, and it's not a bad place. It's just a place, And I think that's been helpful to know that there's a lot of people that are experiencing that. God's called people to be in that space.
That's good. I love the language. Would you call it, what kind of pioneer?
Estranged pioneer.
Estranged pioneer. Yeah, because a lot of times I try to describe that as a third culture kid. It's kind of the missionary term of man, I'm this kind of this hybrid that no one really gets me, and it kind of leaves you. But it's a very lonely feeling, and I think that oftentimes, especially in kind of such kind of divisive times, it can force you to have to choose one or the other so that you can get rid of that loneliness. And so that's very helpful. Last question is, so why do you stay?
Yeah, it's pretty simple, Dahadi. I feel like God has a call in my life. My call is not to a specific evangelical institution. My call is to be as useful to what God is doing in the moment as much as possible. And so I asked myself, God, are you still calling me to vocationally serve as the director of the Send Institute? And God gives me, answers. And so I do that out of obedience. But secondary to that, part of the reason why I continue to serve in predominantly white evangelical spaces is because I do think that there is a transition and there is a balancing of leadership. I don't want to say power, but leadership equity, leadership influence that is at some point is going to require enough of us African-American, Asian, Latino, other people of color to have been in these spaces so that the next generation can come in and lead at a more comfortable level. And in some ways, I feel like I'm a door holder. And if the Lord wants to use me in that way, I'm more than glad to do that, because ultimately it's not about me. It's not about my life. It's about what Jesus wants to do. And if that's what Jesus wants me to do, is hold the door for others, then I want to do that.
Man, well, I really appreciate you.
Thanks for watching another episode of Where Life Exists. Today's video is part of our Why I Stay series. Can you relate to some of the things that we discussed today? What stood out the most? Is there anything I can clarify for you? We love to hear from you. So leave a comment below to let us know your thoughts and questions on today's topics. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to stay up to date with the latest videos and interviews.